Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hayden's Happy Hour. It's been 2 years, but we're back with a wonderful guest who I'm honored to be joined with today. His name is Dr. Heath Carter. He is the Associate Professor of American Christianity here at Princeton Theological Seminary and newly appointed Director of PhD Studies. Dr. Carter, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Hayden. It's great.
So our first year, we do a Life Together class. And all of my peers that were in yours just raved about how wonderful it was and how it actually accomplished the goal of building community.
Yeah.
What do you think you brought to that class specifically, and the idea of the new curriculum here of Life Together, of like building community among students and faculty?
Yeah. I think Life Together is a really important course. It's a course that I think can do a lot, it needs to do a lot of things in our life here at Princeton Seminary. Our first year MDiv students are facing they have a daunting challenge on their hands. They've got to take all these big introductory courses, which for many of them, they're encountering brand new material, both in terms of biblical interpretation and methodology, in terms of church history, and obviously settling into a new community and finding their way. And so one of the things that I know is true is that people come into Life Together and they bring all kinds of different backgrounds into that space, and all kinds of different experiences, different theological outlooks. And so that's one thing. Another thing is people are going through a lot as they settle into this place, and they're having some of their foundational beliefs and ways of thinking and reading the Bible and thinking about their faith are being challenged, and they're just having to find a new community, and all that's happening in that first semester. And I think Life Together is a place, I hope, and this is the way that I try to teach that class when I taught it, where there's a kind of formal is not the right word, even sort of a structured space to debrief and process what's happening in people's lives. My experience here has been like, sometimes, if you talk to a first year MDiv student, you pull them aside, you run into them at the cafeteria or whatever, you say, "How you doing?" Oftentimes they have a lot to say in response to that question, and those are vital conversations that happen just on the side and whatnot. But I think there's really value in there being like a space for us to debrief together and ask together, "How you doing?
Are you all right?
Are you all right?
Yeah.
And who are you? And what's your story?" And one of the things that I love about PTS, but it's also a challenge for us, is that we bring people together who do not agree about many important things, who have very different kinds of experiences, and we have you all in class together. That's hard. And I think one thing that can make it easier and more life-giving and help us to see the gift in that difficult experience is if we know each other's stories, we know each other's griefs, and we know each other's hopes. And I think Life Together is a great place to make that possible, and to lift up and kind of create opportunities for people to just talk about the like things that they're going through in their lives in their first semester here.
Sounds like you're trying to create empathy in some ways for others, even with different opinions.
Yeah, empathy is important. I think, I think that's a huge part of it. I also just think, the other thing that's true is that people come here and a lot of folks are intimidated.
Yeah.
They're intimidated by coming into a, Princeton Theological Seminary, and they're worried that they may not live up to the academic standards of the place. And one thing I loved, the previous dean of the chapel, Jan Ammon, she would always preach this sermon at the very beginning of the academic year. It was called her imposter syndrome sermon. And one of the main points of that sermon was, if you got in here, you're supposed to be here.
Yeah, that's
true. We chose you to come here, and
you're qualified.
Yeah, you're qualified. And so it's partly I want to promote empathy, partly I want to promote a sense of self-love and care and belonging, and so I think that's important too.
That's awesome. And you've done an interview series called Conversations in American Democracy, or On American Democracy?
We call this The Future of American Democracy.
Okay. Yeah. Wow, that's a big topic. Where is it going? Who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
And there were a couple of people that some students here were not thrilled
Yeah.
about being on campus, like
Yeah.
Condoleezza Rice
Yeah.
and a couple others that they feel
Yeah.
maybe not necessary to bring
Yeah.
into the conversation.
Sure.
As someone who believes in always listening, even when maybe it's painful,
Yeah.
or you disagree, or I always think of Jesus correcting the Pharisees rather than shunning them.
Yeah.
He allowed them to come into his space, and he allowed them into his church when he was traveling, even though they fundamentally disagreed with him to the core in and on some aspects, not many, but some.
Yeah.
And he was trying to change things. So are you kind of sharing in that, like, if you want real change, we have to bring everyone to the table?
That's a great question, Ian. I think I have a number of different thoughts on this. I mean, one is that we live in a deeply polarized society. The church is not somehow apart from that polarization. I like to sometimes say that the lines that divide run straight through the heart of American Christianity.
Yeah, that's true.
And so part of what I think is also true and a deeply Christian hope is, and we hope this for ourselves, we hope it for others. I deeply believe in the possibility of transformation. Now, I can't say about any particular person, right? When I go into a conversation with them, I'm not like, oh, I'm going to have a conversation with you so that you will be transformed. But I think that one reason that last year, when I was kind of thinking about and designing that series of conversations, one of my commitments was to make that series broad, and sometimes broader than might feel comfortable to me, even. And the reason for that is partly that I think when you convene a broader conversation, if you believe in transformation, the hope of transformation, you want to get as many people in that conversation as you possibly can. One of the people that I interviewed last year was this guy, Anand Giridharadas, who wrote a book called The Persuaders. He's a person on the left, and it's a book written to the left. And he basically says, hey, friends, I think we're right. And I think, therefore, we've got to hold on to and practice this long-standing democratic, small d, art of persuasion, which is, hey, if we think we're right, let's make arguments. Let's give reasons, and let's try to persuade others that we're right. And there's a lot of data like on this kind of polarization stuff. Like, how do you change people's minds?
Some people say it's impossible.
Some people think it's impossible, and I think, and I guess I certainly hope that they're wrong. I guess I've experienced transformation in my own life, and I grew up. Basically, I've talked about this in other contexts. I mean, I basically grew up in what we would now call like kind of white Christian nationalism in Kansas and Southern California, and like the throes of what, the white evangelical movements of the 1980s and 1990s. And that was just what I grew up in. That was like the soup that I swam in. It was the air that I breathed. It was the world that my churches were sustaining and promoting. And it was going to college and having a roommate who didn't grow up in that world, but who was also a person of faith, who loved me deeply, and who disagreed with me vehemently. And who stayed up with me many, 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 many nights, late into the night. We'd order pizza and be, going back and forth at midnight, our freshman year of college. And over the course of years of conversation, not with just that one roommate, but with other folks too, people that loved me, I changed my mind. Profoundly changed my mind. And I wasn't alone in that. Partly through my own experience, my whole family basically changed its mind about these things. And we're not alone. I mean, I've known so many folks, and I think there's a lot of folks here at Princeton Seminary, students and faculty alike, who grew up in evangelical worlds or worlds that they now have deeper disagreements with, perhaps, but who have been on journeys. And who often, in my experience and just in my conversations with others, one of the key things along the way on that journey has been somebody loved them when they were wrong. And I want us to be a place here, Princeton Seminary, that finds ways. I think that's a transformational kind of love. To love someone when they're wrong.
Yeah.
I don't think everybody's called to love every other wrong person, right? I think that I feel very well poised in my own life to talk to folks that I wouldn't expect my Black or queer or neighbors. So I don't expect everybody to carry this weight equally. I feel that I can, and I feel called to it. And so partly last year, when I chose to sustain a broader conversation, it's because I feel called to that work. And I feel actually in a strange way, and I think a way that maybe some folks here might disagree with me, and I welcome the pushback. When you talk to someone like Condoleezza Rice, that was a huge flashpoint on our campus.
It was.
And it created a lot of controversy. And the thing that I told folks that reached out to me, I disagree with Condoleezza Rice on just about all of the things that she's publicly associated with in terms of the war in Iraq and torture and all these things. And in fact, it's precisely because of that, though, that I think it's important, nevertheless, to engage with someone. Not because you think, again, that you're going to, in 45 minutes on Zoom, change someone's mind.
Yeah.
But because if you want to persuade people that this is sort of traditions that we're sustaining here at Princeton Seminary around, say, peace witness or around the dignity of all humans, if you want to see those traditions win the day, and I do too, you have to actually get out there and talk to people that don't currently hold those positions.
And a lot of people are uncomfortable doing that, as you said before.
Yeah, and I don't blame them, and I don't think everybody's called to the work. I have felt called to that work, and it's partly because of, again, my own story. And I just know so many people. I'm always already immersed in conversation with people with whom I have deep disagreement these days.
Sure.
People in my family. I just went to my sister's wedding. She married a lovely woman named Anna, who I deeply love. And there are people in our family that don't, not in my immediate family, but in my extended family, that don't think that that's right or holy. And I have chosen myself to stay in relationship with them, in part because I want a better world for my sister and Anna. And I can do that work. I don't need to rely on them to do that work. Sure. I should do that work.
Sure.
And so that's my gentle challenge to our community, is for those of us, and I'm one of them, and I think there are other people here, I don't think it's everybody, that have an opportunity and have the privilege to maybe be in those conversations without worry about personal harm. We should be in those conversations, in my view.
I agree with you, and I can't help but think about my own journey with a friend who I've known for many years. He grew up in a large family. I was an only child.
Yeah.
So I always joke that I grew up in a house divided because my mom's Episcopal and my dad grew up Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
Now they go to an Episcopal church.
Okay.
We all know who wins those arguments at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And my dad loves the Episcopal church, but I got to watch his transformation through their marriage, right? So my mom's brother is gay.
Yeah.
And, of course, he grew up, his dad was a 25-year SBC minister. So, of course, he has one paradigm. And then she said, she remembered, she said, the moment I knew I would marry your father is when we went out to dinner with my brother. And then she goes, my brother's gay. And he says, why would that matter?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what he believed. He said, if you love him, I love him.
Yeah.
And she was like, oh, this is someone I can be with.
Yeah.
And so, that transformation happened through relationship.
Yeah. The only way,
it's the only way
the transformation does happen.
Yeah.
I think that's the fundamental thing that I think I sometimes worry about. I understand the desire to seal oneself and one's community off from people who have beliefs that are implicated deeply in violence in the world. And that is a very, I think, a noble and understandable and laudable kind of thing to want to do.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I wonder about and that I worry about is that when we do that, we actually might make the world more dangerous and more violent.
I think so.
Because if we don't engage, and again, not all of us are called to this, but for me, I feel that one of the ways that I can love my neighbor, my Black and queer neighbors in particular, but just my neighbors more generally, is to be engaged in these hard conversations, often with white people, straight people that are part of the problem. And I can be in those conversations, and I do it in the hope of creating a better world for all of God's children.
Yeah. And I don't think that I think I agree with you fundamentally, because I think it's really easy to dehumanize someone you don't have to talk to.
Yeah.
You don't have to look at.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that when we wall ourselves off, we don't have to look at each other.
Yeah.
And we can kind of go into these bubbles. And I think that's a good transition point to American Christianity, and something I wanted to ask you about very specifically. You were promoting like a book that I think a colleague wrote about televangelism, or did you help edit it?
Trying to think about which
the Oral
book?
Roberts.
Oh yeah, Oral Roberts. Yeah. I edit a biography series. I edit it's with a couple other colleagues. I co-edit this series called The Library of Religious Biography.
Okay.
And so we do books on all kinds of folks. And Jonathan Root just published a book earlier this year on Oral Roberts.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a great book. Great book.
So with that, when radio was invented, you know, we really went, it's a weird thing because we kind of went back to an oral tradition, but it's an oral tradition that's not individual, it's collective.
Yeah.
And so when you see this transformation from, okay, you read the Bible and you have a preacher interpret it for you, to now you're giving it to millions of people on the radio, to millions of people on television, now hundreds or millions of people on the internet and social media. Walk me through what you think American Christianity, how it transformed through each of those paradigms.
Well, that's a great question. And a complicated one. I would say this. One of the longer themes, and it goes way back before the radio, in the history of Christianity more broadly, the history of Christianity on this continent in particular, is that sort of revolutions in communications and media have often had a kind of catalytic, unpredictable catalytic impact. So, I mean, the Reformation, the kind of emergence of the kind of spread of print and
Gutenberg press.
Exactly. The printing press, and of Bibles, printed in the vernacular and not just in Latin, had a really tremendous impact on kind of the structure and the texture of life at the grassroots. In the U.S., even before the U.S. was a nation, but certainly in the wake of 1776, one of the things that's been true, obviously in the U.S., religion is disestablished early in the constitutional settlement, and as a result, one of the things that's one of the big impacts of that, and this has been a focus of much study in my field, is that unlike in Europe, where churches could depend on taxes for money, and they could depend on being the state church meant that you had a kind of guaranteed membership. In the US, that was never true. And so part of what's been, I think, a defining feature of American Protestantism in the United States is a kind of entrepreneurial spirit. And a kind of go your own way kind of vibe. And oftentimes I think these media, so radio and television and now obviously the internet and all the apps that I don't even know, social media wise, I'm still like Facebook, Twitter. I've sort of adopted Instagram, and everything beyond that is a mystery to me. I think these media have often allowed folks who didn't necessarily have fancy degrees. They didn't necessarily have institutional sanction. They weren't like being sent out by some kind of denominational body, to get a platform and to have an audience and to kind of espouse their gospel and their way of viewing the world. And frankly, I think that's had mixed effects. I think sometimes that's been, I think in my view, again, we've seen in recent years how devastating it can be when people get a platform for conspiracy, when people get a platform for hate, when people get a platform for all kinds of toxic political ideologies. That's one of the things that this kind of entrepreneurial system affords. It can also, I teach this in my classes, at its best, it can afford a platform and a voice for people who are minoritized or marginalized, who don't have easy access to like fancy pedigree platform kind of opportunities. And so it can have at its best a kind of leveling egalitarian impact. But sometimes it can also, I guess one way of putting this succinctly is that populism, which has been a defining tradition of American life, can have really positive aspects, but it can also have deeply negative. And I think in recent years we've seen both.
I think we have seen both. And I think that if we iron in on populism and nationalism as forces at work in our churches and our culture, I don't think nationalism, should be a dirty word all the time.
Yeah.
There is a sense where if you have a light, you don't put it under a bushel, right?
Yeah.
So in some ways, I think that specifically in bringing it to our context in higher education in the U.S. and in academic bubbles, so to speak, like, because PTS is not the real world. We have a whole country outside of our campus that we have to think about. I think we can really forget that America is still a source of hope for many people around the world today. And I think that the valuable work done by like the 1619 Project of like, no, slavery was evil. Yes, it was. But I think that one point we need to remember is that European and American Christians ended slavery effectively in those places. And there, as it was a huge part of that movement. It wasn't all of it, right? And it was also a source of like keeping people in chains. Many people use Christianity to keep Black and brown people in chains, but it also was a source of liberation. And I think that sometimes we can forget that our country and our faith is a liberating force in this world. And I think that we can only focus on the darkness and the evil that it has helped perpetrate. And sometimes I think that guilt of like what it has been used for kind of makes us silent when we should be, at least like you said, willing to do the work with people that are part of the problem, especially as like you and I are both cisgender white men. So it's like maybe our job is not to be front and center all the time, but maybe we're called to do that work with people that are part of the problem where our brothers and sisters would be uncomfortable.
I mean, you're raising really big questions about kind of American history and about the role of Christianity in it. And I think my inclination on those questions is one, and to underscore that I think that the United States of America is, a nation that was built on slavery. I think that's part of what the 1619 Project's really fundamentally arguing, and I'm convinced by that thesis. Also by dispossession and genocide of Native peoples, and those are really, really deeply heinous kind of stories that we can't pass too quickly by as we think about the meaning of the United States or what this country is about. Christianity has been deeply implicated in those two stories, in baptizing a kind of heinous slave economy and the racism that went alongside and developed alongside of it, as well as with empire, disappropriation of people, murder, these kinds of things. And so part of, in general, especially when I'm talking to white Christian audiences in the United States today, I want to make sure that we have a deep understanding that fundamentally there's a lot that we need to develop the capacity to lament and to seek repair for. At the same time, and so when you say about liberation, I do think that Christianity, I'm a Christian, I believe the gospel, I believe that there is good news in Christianity for all people, and for the world, for the created order, even beyond humans. I think that often the folks who have lived into the good news of the gospel in the United States have not been the people who were in power and who have had and I think, even in the case of slavery, that, so few white Christians were involved in radical abolition. It's really sobering to really, when you start to count, we're really talking about a very small handful of folks. And, abolition, insofar as there's a kind of Christian abolitionism in the United States, it's overwhelmingly Black. And I think that's So these are all things. And then I guess the thing that I would add, and that does go along with what you're saying here, is that I do also in my teaching and my public work want to call us to see, we're living through a crisis for institutions, whether we talk about the institution, huge institutions like the nation, smaller institutions like the local church, and everything in between, higher education, media,
seminaries.
Seminaries, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're living through a crisis of institutions. And I want us, on the one hand, to confront the difficult, tragic, honestly, in some cases, just evil aspects of our history, even as I don't want us, I hope for myself again, I don't feel content to just kind of fall back into cynicism about this current moment. And I think, as far as I can tell, Cheryl and Eiffel, who I interviewed last year for the Future of American Democracy series, spoke very eloquently of the fact that we need really good institutions if we're going to be able to move forward, if we're going to be able to sustain a pluralistic democracy, a nation that, in some way at least aspires to justice for all. We need strong institutions. So I guess in the way that we tell these stories and the way that we talk about the past and its relationship to the present and to the future, part of what I want to do is do that in a way that calls us to lament and repentance and repair, and that calls us to see ourselves as characters in an ongoing story, and as folks who are responsible for, as best we can with what little we know, and being finite creatures ourselves, for redemptively engaging the legacies of the past, and trying to love our neighbors, love them in interpersonal ways, love them in institutional ways. And I think, to me, that's where I end up back at this point of hey, we gotta throw ourselves into churches, congregations, into local politics, sometimes international politics, in order to fight for a world that God hopes for and God wants. And I think that calls us into the struggle, and doesn't allow us to just be cynical.
Yeah, he said the kingdom is at hand. The hand is what you work with.
Yeah.
So maybe you need to look at your hands and see what you're doing.
Yeah.
It's it's a real call, and I believe that that's what's lacking in what was and is lacking in American Christianity. It's kind of because the thing that I said can also be used for harm, because we're this great beacon, we don't have anything else to do. Okay, we have problems, we don't really need to fix them. I mean, look at us compared to China. Look at we're not violating human rights like China is, or Russia, or these other places in the world, and that sort of can create I think American apathy is a very real thing. And sort of the apathetic sort of, well, we're not as bad as everyone else.
I think it's one of these things where, in my view, again, it kind of depends on who you're talking to. When I thought of Valparaiso University in Northwest Indiana, Midwestern school, wonderful students, those students tended to be more conservative, to have a higher view of American history, to look, maybe to kind of more likely to embrace a kind of American exceptionalism. And there, I felt like my responsibility as a historian was to give them a critical lens on the past, and to really help them to see the ways in which the United States has been involved with, and is involved right now, in things that are deeply worrisome, and I mean, even to the level of violations of human rights and whatnot. At the same time, now I teach at Princeton Seminary. My students tend to come in much more, often these days into my classrooms here with a very critical lens.
Almost too critical, I would say sometimes.
Sometimes what I want to say is, I don't know if it's too critical, it's very critical. And sometimes what I want to say is, okay, I agree. Now, what do we do? Who do we want to be? And how do we, I guess for me, I'm always interested in asking, what's the political small p project that you want us to be about? Politics fundamentally is about how we live together in the world. So I'm willing to go pretty far with someone who says, I have deep worries, deep critiques of the United States of America. I think, I do too. Now what? What's the political small p project that we should be about as Christians in the world? And I guess that's where I do want to go. I don't want to leave any of us, including myself, in the place of just criticism, because I think in some ways that's too easy, and we have to figure out, okay, now what are we going to be about in the world? And and for me, I guess I at this point think that there are things that we can do even in this context of this nation state to contribute to a better local community, a better state, better nation, a better world. But I'm open to other possibilities too, and eager to talk with folks about that question of how do we live together in the world.
Yeah, and I think living together, life together, whatever you want to call it, is an interesting way to view these issues, because I think the issues sometimes take precedence over the people involved in them. I was having a conversation in a class recently about the controversy around the movie The Sound of Freedom with Jim Caviezel. And it was sort of like, it contributes to conspiracy theories like Alex Jones, because, as my mom says, every pig finds a truffle every now and then. He found one conspiracy that turned out to be true 10 years later. And then, and then so it's like, should we be highlighting this? What about labor camps? And it sort of took away from the issue, and it became this pedantic conversation of like, well, we don't need to focus on that kind of exploitation of children. Let's focus on the one that's actually the bigger part of the problem. And I think that there can be a tendency to get too pedantic and critical. And it's like, okay, we're talking about children here. Can we all just agree that every way exploiting children is wrong and not get pedantic about how it's being done? And so for me, that was really disturbing, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think you're one of the few people on this campus that are willing to engage in those really hard conversations in an open, loving way, because I think that some people here, because they're students, are not ready to do that yet. And it's understandable, but it's also, I think, something that needs to be criticized, because I've met a lot of people here that say things like, well, I'm really passionate about telling people that they're wrong. And I said, that something about that statement, I think the way you framed it is, I agree with you, now what? It's not you're wrong, let me teach you what the right answer is. And I think that humility is lacking sometimes on our campus and in academia, because we think we have all the answers.
I mean, here's part of what I know is that I've learned a lot. I continue to learn a lot as I go through my life. And I do think having some humility is important. I think I love, my students here on the whole are people that I think are deeply devoted to a better world. And I appreciate that about them. I'm inspired by my students. I think there's really interesting questions about kind of the methodology of building a better world, and how are we going to do it, and how do we, I think in the last decade, amid all the turmoil in American life that's generated these big uncertainties about the future of American democracy, I get why people are upset. I get why they're worried. I get why they want to yell. I get why they want to, I do. And I think at this juncture, though, and I guess part of what I think about with Princeton Seminary, I think Princeton Seminary is a really important place for the church in the world. And I think about, within the global church, it's not just within our parochial national conversation, but within the context of the global church. Princeton Seminary has an opportunity to contribute to these broader global conversations among Christians about how we live in the world, about what the content of our faith, about what our faith means for profoundly difficult ethical questions that in this country and around the world people disagree about. And I guess my tendency and desire is to let's keep that conversation as big as we can. Not because, again, we agree, but because we bring the gifts and the knowledge that we've accumulated along our own journeys, and God's been in the mix of those journeys often. We also, I believe that when we come together, whether in a room or online or whatever, with people that we share a faith with, but we have different views about, I hope that God will be present in those conversations.
Or even to a gathered, there will I be.
I believe that. And I think that, again, I guess I would just come back to this idea that there's sometimes where I'm talking to somebody and I deeply want them to change their mind. But just guess from my own personal experience and from everything I've read that oftentimes the way people change their minds is, like we said earlier, because you had coffee with them and they got to know you and they came to understand someone who knew you with your point of view as someone who they trusted.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you know, again, in my own sort of story, that's how I changed my mind. I remember when I lived in Valparaiso, I was really involved in city politics. And one of the very first things that I was charged with doing, I was chair of the Human Relations Council in the city. Was appointed by a Republican mayor, and Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana at that time. And it was when Pence was trying to pass the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and went through the state legislature. And a lot of folks were worried, and I think very understandably, that we were going to see like discrimination against gay and trans folks in the state of Indiana,
and it was going to be government sanctioned.
Yeah, exactly, and that the law could now be used, you know, cited, you know, to fire someone because they were gay, or to, you know, so, and I talked to the mayor, and I kind of, you know, we decided locally in Valparaiso, small town, university town in Northwest Indiana, that we were going to try to pass a local civil rights law that would extend civil rights to gay and trans people at the local level that didn't have it at the state level. And those conversations were really hard. And we had these huge public meetings where hundreds of people came out on weeknights to give 3-minute speeches for or against the law that we proposed. And I stood up there with a gavel and I listened, and we listened to 80 speeches at one of those meetings, 80 3-minute speeches. And many of them, in many cases, everybody on all sides was talking about Jesus, and they were talking about their views and their faith and how it, you know, related to their views about local life. At one of those meetings, a local pastor, who was pastor of one of the largest churches in town, stood up and spoke against the law. And he was quoted in the newspaper the next day against the law. And I, you know, that was upsetting to me as someone who was.
How old were you at the
championing the law? It's a good question. I was 34 years old at this point.
So you were well established in your career. You weren't like in your 20s.
I wasn't in my 20s, but yeah. I was still young. I was on the tenure track. I wasn't tenured. You know, young family, just finding my way in the world, and found myself up on the gavel, up on the dais with the gavel, and in this huge civic realm. And you know, my response to the pastor that spoke against the law, let's go to the paper, was I shot him an email and I said, "Hey, we don't know each other. Could we get coffee?" Yeah. And we did. We had coffee. I showed up at his office, and he had read my book before I showed up. And we had a long conversation. At the end of the conversation, we didn't agree, but he said to me, "I'm not going to speak against this law anymore." And over the next few years, he and I, we hung out sometimes, and we got to know each other, and we became friends. Now, I the whole time felt that he was deeply wrong about many things, but we had gotten together with he had my spouse and I over at one point to hang out with him and his spouse. We got to know each other. There was always an honesty about what we didn't agree about. And the spring that I ended up taking this job, I was actually running for city council in Valparaiso, and I was running as a Democrat. And this pastor, I don't think, had voted for a Democrat in his adult life. And he told me over coffee that spring, when I was running in the Democratic primary, which I won before I left to come here.
God didn't want you in politics.
He said, Heath, I'm going to vote for you. Yeah. And to me, I guess like that story, what does that underscore for me? For me, it underscores something, again, that I've experienced in my own life, that I've seen in my own family, that I've seen in many communities, that you're not always going to change somebody's mind just because you're their friend. And we shouldn't have friendships just to change someone's mind. But when you are friends with somebody that you disagree with, I think if you're ever going to change someone's mind, it's going to be because they felt that they could trust you. It's going to be because they felt loved by you. It's because as they got to know you, they came to see this value or this idea that you held so deeply as more reasonable, maybe even more good. And this is what I found in my life. And it's the spirit that I bring into my classrooms. I'm not trying to convince all my students to agree with me. In fact, I know I need to learn from my students. But I approach the classroom, I approach personal relationships, I approach myself. I'll give you one more, I know I'm talking too much, but one more quick story. I mean, last year at the beginning of the Democracy series, I did an interview with 3 pastors about polarization and the way it was playing its way out in their congregations. It was Melissa Flora-Bixler and Duke Kwan and Karen Oliveto. And Karen Oliveto spoke so eloquently to this. She's the first openly queer bishop of the United Methodist Church. She's out in the Mountain West.
And the Methodist Church is having a massive split right now over these issues.
Massive split. And Karen has experienced deep personal affront in the course of just doing her job of being an ordained bishop. In fact, she narrates in her book, she's told me, she talked about in the interview, these experiences of having her colleagues, her fellow bishops, who didn't acknowledge her authority, of having congregations that she would visit, literally get up and walk out as she was praying.
Wow.
So she says in the course of the interview, I bear on my body the scars of the kind of harm that people can inflict. She also went on to say, she said, I lament that the conservatives in the Methodist Church are leading right now. And she says, I lament it, and this is, pretty close paraphrase. I highly recommend people watch this interview. I think I was so moved by the conversation, especially between her and Melissa Flora-Bixler, both of them beautifully bringing together different thoughts on these kind of questions. Karen says, I lament that the conservatives are leaving because, they need transformation. She says, but I know that I need transformation too. And that's what the Holy Spirit can do.
Yeah.
And I believe that fundamentally. And I think it's a deeply Christian hope. I deeply believe in transformation, not just that I get to transform others by loving them, but that I will also be transformed. And I guess I'm sober enough about my own sinfulness and limitations to know, like, God's not done with me yet either. I need to remain open to where God might lead, and I can find God's voice and nudge and direction in a whole wide world of folks out there that I may not go into the conversation with thinking I have anything to learn from. But throughout my life, I've learned from people I didn't expect to learn from.
But isn't that such a wonderful thing when it happens?
It's a beautiful thing. And it often for me, honestly, just because of who I am, sometimes, I mean, you're saying you sometimes get frustrated with students who are like, oh, I don't want to talk to people I did agree with. I mean, I argued my way through college. I didn't go into these conversations with the folks I disagree with being like, I know I have much to learn from you, so tell me about what you think and I'll tell you what I think. I was just like, you're wrong.
Yeah, I do that all the time.
Yeah, this is what I think. And I look back at myself when I was 18, 19, 20, and the way I even spoke with my professors in college, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I was so audacious. I was so self-assured. One of my
aren't we all though?
I don't know.
18 and 19, aren't we in some ways self-assured?
I was too self-assured. I remember I was in a theological method class, and my professor said to me, you really have a lot of assumptions, which she was right about. And I, 19 and all, I was like, so do you. And that was like this evangelical thing in me. And I look back on it, and I wish I would have had more humility, because I really did need to learn a lot. But it makes me all the more grateful, given how I needed to have more humility at that point. But even still, somehow friends and professors loved me nonetheless. And hung in there with me. And I was changing my mind in every one of those conversations. Like slowly, my mind was changing. And I give thanks to God for the people that God put in my life that
to allow for that personal transformation through relationship. Because isn't that what our faith is? It's personal transformation through relationship with the Holy Spirit through Jesus Christ, given by the Father.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. I think it can also be communal transformation.
It's community,
There can be transformation of community and systems and structures and
yeah.
But I believe in personal transformation, and I think
I mean, our God's not dead; He's alive in the world. If we want to have a faith that means anything to me, it's like I loved what Barnes said before he left. It's like we have to swing back to rely on tradition, but then swing forward into a new hope.
Yeah.
Like we have to not abandon where we've come from, like you said. And it's interesting you mentioned the word evangelical because it's kind of a dirty word here. And I was in a precept, it was a history precept actually, and somebody said, would anyone here self-identify as evangelical? And of course, everyone looks around and I shoot my hand up as I'm now 26, I was 25 at the time. And I say, am I the only one? I know some of you here come from evangelical churches. And kind of haughty, like, oh, I'm the only one that's brave enough to raise his hand, sort of thing. And then the preceptor looks at me with the most loving, and she said, tell us why you raised your hand. And I looked around and I was like, okay, I could take this as my moment, right? I could take this as my moment to prove to everyone how evangelical shouldn't be a dirty word and that it's been co-opted by politics. And I could go into this whole pedantic speech about blah 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 and flex my intellect or whatever. And I just sat back for a second. I closed my eyes and I said, okay, what does that actually mean to me? And I thought about it for like 3 or 4 seconds. And I started speaking and I said something along the lines of, evangelical is not about what you believe. And I think that it's been turned into a list of doctrinal statements, like many of our churches have been turned into doctrinal statements. And I said, what evangelical means to me is that I'm willing to profess to anyone who asks the transformative power of God in my own life, in my family, in my community. And I think that if I'm willing to say that and let that light shine through me, I can't take that away because I think that there's something deeply real about the evangelical movement, like in Britain and in Europe and in all these places, that people were recognizing that our churches can't be the mediators of our morality because they're institutions. So we have to rely on those institutions, but we also have to take personal responsibility for our own lives and say, listen, we can't just say that the church is right about everything. And I said, the reason that I would call myself evangelical is because I'm not willing to say that the church as it stands today is right about everything. And then people looked at me and they said, wow, I never thought about it that way before. But it wasn't because I was trying to prove myself. It was because I believe that I let the Holy Spirit change me and use a different message than the one that I would have said before.
Right. Yeah, I mean, evangelical is a word that obviously does come with a lot of baggage these days. There's been a lot of studies that show in the contemporary context that evangelical in some contexts can just mean someone who supports Trump, right? People who aren't even Christian.
Especially if you say white evangelical, it can mean that.
Definitely. I think that word has a long history in the history of Christianity, and there's like churches like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is a mainline church,
the ELCA,
very, very relatively speaking, liberal church that is using that word in an older way to talk about just like Reformed faith and Protestant faith. So I think like the way that you're thinking about it, that sounds like a faithful and lovely way to think about kind of how that term can be meaningful for you in a way that doesn't connect with a lot of the really destructive things that are happening right now. I sometimes when I teach the history of evangelicalism in my classes, I'm also interested in like this 19th century use of the word that really described a kind of broad Protestant coalition that was theologically and politically diverse, and that was deeply oriented around kind of the call to personal and societal transformation. I think there's a lot to like in that tradition, actually. It had its deep failings, and I talk about those in my classes. But that version of evangelical, I find, has a lot to commend it, and it's one that I think does live on here at Princeton Seminary. There's folks in the 1940s that basically took the term and sought to claim it for their own more sectarian movement. And
a misappropriation, maybe.
Yeah, or just like a particular appropriation that turned out to be, from a marketing perspective, very successful.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested personally in that project, but I think the broader thing that evangelical meant prior to the 1940s, which was this kind of idea of a broader Protestant coalition. Again, there's things about that thing too that I would dissent from, but that I also find in part attractive and connected to what we're doing here at PTS, but not in the way that, you know, when students hear the word evangelical today, they think about Donald Trump. That's not what that term has always meant.
No, and I think that we have a short view sometimes. And as a historian, I think probably part of your mission is to give us a longer view of our history.
I believe in the long view. I believe in the long view. So yeah, I think that's a big part of what historians can do, and you know, offer, you know, one of the things I often say in Life Together, my Life Together section is called, the theme is how we got here.
Yes.
And I really think that it's important to know how we got here if we want to know how to move faithfully forward. And in that sense, I think that history isn't just for history buffs. History is not just for folks who want to do their PhDs. History is really for, it's not even just for pastors, it's for all Christians. And we have so much to learn from the people, the saints who have gone before us. And I really, you know, believe and hope that as we like study stories from the past, we can really get better perspective on where we should go today.
Well, Dr. Carter, thank you so much for taking this time today. We've reached the 1:30 mark, and I know you're a busy man, but I really appreciate you coming and talking with us today.
Such a pleasure, Hayden. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, man. Thank you. That was wonderful.
Oh, you're very welcome. That was a great conversation.
Yeah. I